Since 2003, this is the Sports Source, East Tennessee's #1 sports talk show.
Presented by Hype Wrench, and by Junk Be Gone, and by the Garza Law Firm.
With your host, John Pennington. The Sports Source starts now.
Good Sunday morning and welcome into the Junk Be Gone studios for today's episode of the Sports Source. We're happy to have you with us. As always, we are closing in on football season. That means fall camp is practically done. We're halfway through it. So what are the biggest stories? What are the stories we're watching? What are we worried about? What are we happy about? We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about Josh Heupel. What kind of trajectory, easy for me to say, is he on in terms of past UT coaches? We'll discuss that. We got a lot to cover. Recruiting update. Is there news on the way? We'll talk about where the Vols stand at this moment. Lots to do. Let's get right into it. First segment of today's show brought to you by Junk Be Gone. Just looking around my home this week, I've got a front yard project that's going to be a mess for a couple of months. I've got a spare room that has gone, if I'm honest, from being a storage room to a hoarder's room. I really need to clean all this stuff up, so how do I do it? Well, it's easy. I'm going to call Junk Be Gone. You call Junk Be Gone, they haul the junk away. You can load it up, or they can load it up if you want their teams to do it. Junk Be Gone, simple, affordable, local. JunkBeGone.biz. Give them a call this week. I can't recommend them more highly for your home or your business needs. All right, let's welcome in the first wave of panelists. We got one more guy waiting in the wings over there, but you'll see on the graphic where all these guys work. But we have Ryan Callahan, Josh Ward, David Ubben, Will West. Thank to all of you for being here. I want to get this out of the way when we start. Before we get into the show today, I want to fire up our viewer poll. And we will be discussing this topic a little later in the show, but the question is, which potential first loss for Tennessee would be the most worrisome? Would it be the loss at Florida if you lose down there? Would it be South Carolina at home? Would it be Texas A&M at home? There's a reason I'm asking this question, and we'll discuss it a little bit later, but you tell us which would be the most worrisome, the loss at Florida, the loss to Carolina, or a loss to Texas A&M. And don't get mad. Nick Saban has only had 2 undefeated teams at Alabama. Teams lose, so you don't have to turn the channel. You're suggesting they'll lose. Most teams do. But take part in our poll. Get your camera. Take a look at the little QR code. Click that. Or go to sportsource.tv/polls and play along with us. And I will tell you this. I talked to a buddy of mine. I've said this before, that the company that runs this thing has been impressed by how many people are clicking on our show in the middle of August. Talked to a news director who used this in this same system in Baltimore, Maryland. He said, we used it every day. He could not believe how many of you are clicking and playing this thing. I said, hey, it's Tennessee football. What do you expect? All right, let's get into this. Josh, only a few more practices left before we get into the season. They're actually going into kind of a false game week mode this week at UT. What's the biggest story so far? Is it the offensive line? Where are you going with this? What's the biggest story coming out of fall camp so far for Tennessee?
Well, a lot of camp to me is trying to figure out answering questions from the summer that carry over into August. So I'll say the offensive line and largely the interior of the offensive line. We know John Campbell Jr. is going to be at left tackle. Yeah. You have somebody that played last year at right tackle, so we'll just see how that plays out. You have the question of Cooper Mays' health at center, which affects the left guard position, which was already a question coming into camp that will just have to be unanswered as long as you're waiting on Cooper to come back at the center position. So last year having Cooper and Jerome Carvin so reliable center and left guard, and neither of those guys available at least to start the season. And then there's already the question, can Cooper be available when he comes back all season long? That to me is the biggest remaining question.
Yeah, Heupel continues to make it sound like it's not going to be a big deal. I talked to an offensive lineman this week who, as we discussed on the show last week, if there's one position that needs continuity, that needs to get a feel, and not only replacing 2 guys, but just regularly. You need those guys to get a chemistry together. You got a new quarterback, so for the center to be out, not optimal. That's not the best thing. Ryan, what's the number one thing on your agenda? Is it that offensive line?
I would agree it is the offensive line. And not only all of that, but it's just, Cooper Mays is going to go through an entire camp with basically no contact work, very little time in the weight room and things like that, the strength levels might not be where they need to be going into the season, and he's going to have to adjust on the fly and get right back into it. So that's not ideal whenever he does come back. So yeah, I think that's a huge concern. The offensive line was already a concern about this team to me. Now you kind of chip away at what was one of the areas you felt pretty good about, the interior guys with Cooper Mays and Javonte Spraggins. The tackles were supposed to be the question marks. Now it's the interior, and that's a big concern.
Gentlemen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the offensive line jumps off the page at you, but I still want to see the secondary. You look at what happened to this team last year, and certainly that South Carolina game. You can't put it all at the secondary's feet, but that's a huge part of it, and I think that starts at the corner. You have a lot more experience at safety, but the corners, some experience, but they say experience is a good teacher. Let's hope that teacher is winning some awards, and that's not a first year out of college. So we'll see.
I'm going to be boring. It's the offensive line. They've gone from we could go 10 deep in week 1 to we don't have a backup center. We don't know who the 5 are going to be there to go in to start. To me, that means there's been a wrench thrown into it somehow, some way. Or guys they evaluated in one way in spring, they now feel a completely different way about now that they're in fall camp. It's weird that you're in week 2, week 3 of fall camp, and you start looking for a backup center. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It makes me think the plan you had to change.
Let me throw out something that may change the verdict on this. I don't think it will. But one thing we've seen through 2 years, and I think Jimmy Himes, who will be out here next, pointed this out last year at one point. You look at that offensive line, and it produces more than the individual parts suggest it should. You've got guys, no offense to the guys who played over there, but you had Darnell Wright, who went high in the draft. It hasn't been a loaded offensive line. And yet they have produced well. Is that at all a balm, a salve for the worries right now about the offensive line, or do you sit there and go, well, yeah, those guys worked together. They had continuity. You don't have that now. So do you look at that and the fact that offensive line, that system has helped the O-line in the past? Does that alleviate some of your worry or no?
I think it does, as long as Joe Milton can be the same guy in a lot of ways that Hendon Hooker was. And that's the big question I have. Yeah. Is Joe Milton going to get rid of the ball quickly enough to make that offensive line less of a concern? He has a tendency at times to hold the ball too long, not make quick enough decisions. If that's an issue again, then the offensive line becomes a big problem. So to me, it all hinges on number 7. How does he play?
Yeah, I think that you're 100% right. I think what it means is these problems are solvable pretty quickly with Tennessee's offensive line. And you do have a lot of options as far as the players that you can use, because you don't need to be the 96 Cowboys offensive line right now, right? How many times did you really see anybody on that line, including Wright, really blow somebody just 5-7 yards off the ball? That's not what this offensive line does. Create a seam, a place where a guy can run, hold your guy for a couple seconds and pass pro. That's really all you're asking of this offensive line right now.
Yeah, I think for whatever it's worth, this offense still is a numbers game, and so it's not like you need this offensive line to go up against 7-8-man box and y'all still got to take care of business. That's just not what they do. But I think also at the quarterback spot, I think that Hendon Hooker did really well that people really underrate is that pocket presence, the eyes in the back of his head, extending plays without getting too far, outside of the pocket and having to take off. Just extending plays a second, taking a step, a shoulder shake. We have not seen that from Joe Milton. We've seen probably the opposite from Joe Milton. We've seen him as actively bad pocket presence. So, have you grown a lot in 2 years? We haven't seen a ton of him. He looked pretty good in the Clemson game, but the offensive line played really well in that game. Vanderbilt didn't put up much of a fight, so we'll see. I think they can get by, but they need some help from Milton.
Very quickly, David mentioned secondary as his second worry. Does everybody agree with that? Does anybody else have a second big story? It doesn't have to be a worry.
Edge rush. I would say it's the edge rushers right now.
And to me, those are always combined.
They are, yes.
If you got an edge rush, makes me worry less about your backfield. If you got a backfield, I'm going to worry less about your pass rush. But edge rush.
Yeah, edge rush. Who are the guys going to be? They replaced Byron Young. You didn't have a ton of sacks last year. You had to blitz a ton. Are you going to have to blitz with these linebackers again this year? Or can you get there with 4? Because if you can get there with 4, you help that secondary out a lot.
I'll say that's, when we talk about big storylines of camp so far, that to me is one of the positives that we've gotten so far, is that I've heard James Pierce's name quite a bit. I think he's had a good camp. So that's a good sign to me that you've got a pass rush maybe developing. Josh Josephs is starting to show more flashes. Still not a consistent thing, but it's getting there more consistently. So if they keep that up, I would feel a lot better about that concern. But yeah, until further notice, it's at least something to worry about.
Josh?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question, secondary edge pressure combined. Just because you have to replace Byron Young, we know who the players are, the guys you're mentioning right there. Can they go produce here in a few weeks? A positive to go with that would be Really positive reports out of the interior of the defensive line, how disruptive they might be able to be with the addition of somebody like Omar Norman-Lott, with other guys that are coming back, and a lot of positivity about the linebackers.
Omar Norman-Lott, his name may be the one that's popping, to me, the one I'm hearing the most, that I didn't anticipate hearing the most.
Rodney Garner's not going to call you an upgrade unless he means that you're an upgrade.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Let me go ahead and tell you what we got coming up on the show. I almost forgot our tease here. Still to come, Josh Heupel versus past UT coaches. Key stats from last year, they're going to be better or worse in 2023. Got a big recruiting update. What would be the worst first loss? We're at 54% Florida, 45% South Carolina. Okay, if you think South Carolina would be more worrisome, let us know. Interesting that Texas A&M's just got one vote so far. One solitary vote for A&M. Conference contraction. We've heard expansion. We've heard realignment. Is contraction next? And we'll tell you how you, this fall, can play against the Cavaleris line. That's cool. We've never done that before. Now we can. All right, when we come back on the Sports Source, our guys will tell you whether some of the national projections folks are making about the Volunteers are legit or not. Going back on the Sports Source.